everybody, and welcome to Tabcast, the podcast that brings you fresh ideas and bold voices that are shaping the future of cities, equity, design, agriculture. I am your host, Tanya, and today we are diving deep into one of the most pressing and complex challenges of our time. The theme is called How Do We Design a Food System That Is Equitable? Joining us today is someone who's right at the intersection of food justice, urban equity, and innovation. We have Thea-Isabella Otto. Welcome to the podcast, Thea. I am so happy to have you today. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm great. Thank you.
Great. So, Tia, from supply chains to access, policy to pricing, our food systems impact every one of us, and yet not all of us have experience from equally. Can you paint a picture of the existing inequities in our food systems for the audience, and who do you think is being left behind, and why is that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and obviously a very broad question as well. I think we always have to look at the sort of pillars of food security overall in order to assess that. And then you also see that there's different challenges around food security depending where you are, as you just pointed out. And so essentially what I'm thinking about, like the food system and how equity plays a role in it, is that you can see how in rural versus urban areas there's a clear distinction. So what we see is that for instance, in rural areas, you have a lot more problems around access to food, while in urban areas, there's a lot more inequalities when it comes to affordability, as well as utilization nowadays, actually. So how is food being produced? How can I prepare meals is actually becoming a very difficult subject in urban areas. Um, and then while we look in more of the rural and smallholder country production areas where communities do have access to a certain amount of food.
Right. So, Priya, if we were to again extend our conversation to the relevant inequities in the food system cycle. So, we were discussing earlier about the differences in the rural and urban areas. So, how do you think these inequities are currently playing out in different capacities between the urban and the rural areas?
Yeah, very good question. So I think so we do have, obviously, if we look on a global scope, then we have the developing countries where there is a lot of smallholder farming. So actually, if we look at it, obviously, we all know that 80% of agriculture is smallholder farms, and those are primarily present in developing countries. Um, those are very different ecosystems than what we see in developed countries, where agriculture is highly industrialized and one farmer has to feed a lot of different amount of people. And at the same time, if we look at the urban versus rural kind of perspective, is that in urban areas, actually, there's a lot of inequity when it comes to affordability and income
Right.
overall in the population, which obviously then limits access to food, right? So affordability and access are, I would say, one of the pressing issues in rural areas nowadays. Well, in urban areas, while in rural areas, it's a lot more around getting access from an infrastructure point of view. So like it's the infrastructure that the logistics, the electricity supply, etc. Like how does storing food, and let's say even like roads, etc. Like how does that affect the access to the food that we're consuming? So those are more the equality, equity issues that I see.
Inequities. Yeah, I think I agree
Yes,
with
thank you.
you.
Inequities.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. And now I want to move us into the realm of policy. Food systems are also, deeply shaped by regulation and political priorities, especially in today's world where we have a lot of different set of agricultural based policies existing, whether it's about trade, whether it's about investment, whether it's about funding technologies. So from your work and perspective, what are the most critical policy levers that we should be pulling to close these equity gaps in terms of policy making?
Yes, thank you for your questions. I think what we see is that first of all, in a lot of the countries around the globe, most of them have access to food actually as a human right. Hence, providing that access is a big part of the governmental structure. And what we see, for instance, in countries like the UAE, right, is that they put food security as a very, very high um, goal for their countries,
Right,
uh, let's say, priorities, right? The the most important levers in that sense are that you need to provide a certain level of innovation. So you need to enable innovation within the country in order to get there. However, again, right, how much innovation is necessary? So how much do we need to invest in innovation? Because how much innovation is actually gonna be in the end useful for commercialization?
right,
So like the investment into innovation is definitely crucial. And then identifying also the different stakeholders that are within your country, within your ecosystem. Because if we look at policies, it's different wherever you are. There is no one size fits all. There is not like, oh, Singapore succeeded in these two or three pillars, perhaps, but that doesn't mean that it's going to work in New York, right?
right.
So
Absolutely.
definitely you got to look at the ecosystem, you got to look at the local stakeholders that are present. Coming back to the smallholder farming, in a lot of developing countries, smaller farms are being led by women simply because the men have different works to do and are leaving the properties more often.
Right,
Um, so you got to include their rights into your policy making, which is the shifts that we're seeing a lot right now, is that actually land ownership rights, those kind of things are changing, giving more power to the people who are actually on the ground and who are responsible for today's food supply.
right,
And so these are the different stakeholders that all need to come together in order to provide that let's say a policy structure and to
right.
have that
I
plan,
think,
right?
yeah, I think, yeah, you very correctly mentioned that one shoe does not fit all. And this, by mentioning all of that, you did explain to us that, a good food policy has to be, all inclusive. And to work at the local level, it is important to incorporate all the stakeholders that are eventually going to be part of the process, be it women, be it the youth, if not men, then which sector of the society needs to take up a step forward in order to support the agriculture, especially in smallholder farming case. So, if I were to ask you a standout example from a city or a country that is currently doing this right now, and you think that they are currently presenting a good model, would you have an answer for me on that?
I think it's very, very difficult. I think maybe not to name, but what helps to look at obviously is at the food security index that
Mm-hmm.
is publicly available, which is like taking into account lots of parameters and variables in order to create that index. And just looking at that obviously gives you quite a good of an idea who's, let's say, a leader. Overall, I think we're always very negative because in the end, it's true, there's still a lot of people that are facing hunger every day. There's a lot of people that are having uh, insufficient diets every day, whether it's in actually developing or developed countries. Um, but I think what's important to see is that over time, even though a lot of the news is bad, we have actually improved. There
Right.
is less people that are facing hunger today than there was uh, a few decades ago. And I think we're still having it in our mindset that everything is very bad. But on a lot of different levels, from grassroots to, let's say, global policies, there's a lot being done to tackle that and to face that issue. So I would say definitely the food security index is a good guideline to look at who's in the leading. But again, that doesn't mean that you can take the strategy of the number one city and just replicate it, because it
Absolutely.
probably won't work for every country and for every city.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah.
So, yeah, speaking of collaboration, some of the most powerful shifts we are currently seeing in the food system transformation are community-led, whether it is mutual aid networks, local farming co-ops, or food justice movements. So, what do you see as the power of community in transforming our food systems today?
It's a it's a very interesting question. So I think if we again look at food security and we look at the pillar of utilization, I think community plays a crucial role. I
Right,
think communities are having the responsibility of preserving knowledge and bringing that on to the next generation. And that's where I believe the true added value lies. There's a lot of, let's say, urban farming models that are popping up. You see a lot of these rooftop farms, etc. Those will never feed the world. It's just by scale impossible. But what they will give is the connection to our food, the also kind of the respect, right, that we need to have to the food that we're eating, and having like understanding how long it takes to
right,
come to that result. So these communities for me are really important in order for knowledge sharing. And when it comes to co-op, what you mentioned, so like um having an amount of farmers that are coming together and like selling your produce, that actually gives governance.
mm,
So this again is also very important if we look at the rights of a farmer, because they're being the lowest in the food chain in terms of payment.
right,
So creating those types of communities within the agriculture system is of paramount importance, because otherwise they will like merely be underpaid. And so that's the type of communities that then yeah, I would say are important for gaining governments within the food system.
right.
um
Yeah, if I were to now shift the conversation to economic equity, food is deeply tied to income and labor, and also it is a very big part of global trade right now. So, what would a truly equitable food economy look like in your perspective, and how do we begin to shift power towards that vision?
I think it's a very, very difficult question. I think what we see with current political developments is that we are very intertwined in a globalization and
Right,
in a global, as you said, trading system, right? So um, in order to make that equitable, we again have to, coming back to your question beforehand, we have to bring all stakeholders to the table. And if we look at fairness, I'm not sure personally if that will ever exist. Um, Not to draw the devil on the wall here, but I believe that we are a bit more stepping back actually from where we are right now. I think a lot of the countries are identifying their urgency to be more self-sufficient when it comes to food production. And while the past decades have been focusing a lot more on, for instance, producing vast amount of commodities in order to export, they're now realizing that once we have certain political changes,
right,
uh, they in the end don't have much to eat for themselves. And so we've seen a lot of tariffs and yeah, certain embargoes happening,
trade wars.
where countries were saying, okay, we're just going to stop exporting right now, because we actually see the dependencies. We actually see that within this certain commodity, we're supplying a vast majority of the
Mm,
global ecosystem, but in the end, we actually don't produce enough, or a diverse enough crop, how would you say, like a crop,
Variety?
different type of crops for your own country to be fed, right?
Right.
So in order to have, I mean, in order to answer your question and coming to that equitable food system, what would happen is that farmers are being paid fairly, obviously. And I believe that something such as true cost accounting is going to come into play for that, because it's not only how much is the farmer being paid, but also what is the actual impact that this had on our planet and the ecosystem as a whole. Um, but I think what is happening right now is a lot more focus on self-sufficiency within our own borders. And with that, bringing in the right knowledge into the country in order to do so. So it's a very, very difficult question, and it's a very broad matter, a bit visionary, if you want to say so.
Right.
But overall, I think, yeah, you got to bring everybody to the table. You got to understand how long our food supply chains actually are nowadays, and
Hmm.
who is being involved, and who is underserved within this supply chain.
Right, correct. Makes sense. So, Thea, this has been such a rich conversation with you. And before we wrap up, if you had one message for urban planners, policymakers, and innovators that are currently working on food systems, what would it be? And then after this, we would sign off.
Thanks so much. So I think overall it's about building a system that, is that centers marginalized voices, from women smallholders to the poor, to leverage tech for accessibility but not for exclusivity, because I think that's something we didn't touch up before, but a lot of the high tech production now also, it produces very high end produce, but it doesn't feed the broad masses. So I
Hmm.
think in that sense, speaking about um, equitable food system, that's very important to mention. Um, and really building strategic partnerships in order to drive innovation, but then also like paving the way to commercialization.
Right,
Um, so in order to really have a balanced ecosystem, and yeah, I guess prioritizing equity and inclusion at every stage of our food system. Listening to voices and people that have the right knowledge, and solutions, and ensure that, yeah,
right.
we serve everybody and not just a few people.
Right, very well summarized, I think, Tia. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights on what are some of the different perspectives and windows and verticals that are associated with the idea of food equity, and how currently a lot of angles are to be involved into really providing a more sustainable and a more resilient equitable food system. So that is all for today's episode of Tabcast. And until next time, I would really want everybody to stay curious and stay committed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for the lovely moderation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.